Hello learners, today we are going to study the book of Genesis. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. Other names for Pentateuch in some translations are the 5 books of Moses or the Torah. The book of Genesis serves as an introduction to the rest of the Pentateuch. Genesis is the book of the beginnings. It is the beginning of time, life, sin, salvation, the human race and the Hebrew nation. With a very few exceptions, the Jewish and the Christian scholars believed that Moses wrote Genesis. Genesis is the foundational book to the rest of the Bible. Genesis covers more time than any other book in the Bible. It opens with the words, "In the beginning God created," and ends in a coffin in Egypt. It thus covers the whole plight of man who was created in God's own image to live forever, but because of sin was destined for the grave. The book leaves the reader anxiously anticipating the redemptive intervention of God. Book of Genesis can be divided into 2 parts. The first part is the creation of the universe, primeval history of the human race, and the second part is the patriarchic history of the beginning of the Jewish nation. Now, let us have a look at the objectives of this lesson. To study the universal appeal of the book of Genesis, to analyze the historical relevance of the book of Genesis, to analyze the suitability of the title to the work, to study and understand the characteristics and the nature of man, to analyze the idea of creation, for comparative study of the origin from other texts, to study as history of mankind and as a literary narrative. And now, let us have a look at the summary. Genesis, the book, is a narrative prose whose main function in the Bible is to recount history. The first 11 chapters of Genesis differ from those that follow. These could be described as the survey of the world before Abraham. In these chapters, the reader can appreciate the unique nature and character of the biblical accounts of creation and the flood. This book opens with a majestic description of how God created the heaven and the earth and how He ordered the earth to become a dwelling place. The emphasis is mainly on how God orders and structures everything and how things fall into place by His words. The author describes the 6 work days and the 7th day as God's Sabbath. Each of the 6 work days follow the same pattern. It begins with "and God said" and closes with "and there was evening and there was morning." After declaring God as the creator, the focus is mainly on God bringing things into existence by His word and ordering the created things as "let the waters be gathered together." Genesis establishes a hierarchy of authority of God over all His creation. The uniqueness of God's creation is man. Here, word man is used in a generic sense. When God created the world with His word, God created man with His own hands and breathed His breath into his nostrils, and man became a living being. Man was special to God in all His creation, as God created man in His own image. God gets angry with man after his first disobedience and punishes him by sending him out of the Garden of Eden, following which begins the toil, pain, and suffering of man. Genesis then shows the genealogy of the first man, Adam, on earth, the pain and suffering caused to him, and the wickedness of his children. In this lineage comes Noah, who finds favor in God's sight. When God finds sin increase in the world, he plans to destroy the complete human race with a flood, except for the family of Noah. Learners, today we are going to study the book of Genesis from the Bible. Though according to the Christian and Jewish faith, God is the author, it is accepted that Moses is the author of the book. Approximately, it could have been written sometime around 1500 BC to 1300 BC, though biblically and historically, several hundreds of centuries must have separated him from the patriarchs. Genesis, the book, is a narrative prose. So let's discuss narrative prose as a genre. A narrative is a constructive format of a work of speech, writing, song that describes a sequence of non-fictional or fictional events. The word derives from the Latin verb narrare, which means to tell. A narration has many meanings, and its broadest sense, it is just storytelling. Many scholars argue that Genesis should be viewed as a separate genre. Some call it a hymn, and some poetic, and some view it as a legend. According to C. John Collins, narrative prose in Genesis is extremely unusual. It has refrains, repeated statements that continually return as they do in a hymn or song. There are many examples, including the 7-time refrain, "And God saw that it was good," as well as repetitions of "God said," 10 of "Let there be," 7 repetitions of "And it was so," as well as others. Obviously, this is not the way someone writes in response to a simple request to tell what happened. In addition, the terms for the sun as the greater light, the moon as the lesser light, are highly unusual and poetic, never being used anywhere else in the Bible. And the beast of the field is a term for the animal that is ordinarily confined to poetic discourse. Hence, it is also called as an exalted prose narrative. He uses the phrase exalted prose narrative just to show that it is not poetry. Originally written in Hebrew language and then translated into English, Genesis is a record of the history of creation and mankind, of what Jews, that is, the people at that time in the Mediterranean region, believed Moses to be a prophet and a mediator between God and man, and a leader to the 12 tribes of Israel. Moses wanted to show that God has a unified plan for the whole of history. Moses, in a way, was protector of Israelites from diverting and faltering. Israelites were in bondage in Egypt for a period of 400 years and were practicing the pagan religion of the Egyptians. They were brought out of slavery by Moses, and a law was given by Moses for them to follow. Moses wanted the Israelites to know that there was only one true God who made the heaven and the earth. He made a material world and made it a fit place for human beings to live, love, and to serve. Every human being needs to know and love this God who is beyond description. Thus, one God rules over all things. He has not limited himself to work within the natural things. He can work beyond the natural, which he exhibits in his creation. This Creator God made the first human beings, Adam and Eve, with dignity and purpose, and to live faithfully, not just to him, but to one another as well. Sin makes a man fall in God's sight. God is the sole authority, and being omnipresent, cleanses the earth by fulfilling his covenant. Moses, in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, tries to bring out complete character of God as supreme, preeminent, benevolent, protector, etc. At the same time, he demands moral behavior. The word Genesis means origin or the beginning. The book of Genesis is a record of many beginnings. In fact, it is called by many as the book of beginnings. It records not just the origin of human race, but many other things as time, life, creation, sin, history, relationships, intervention, natural disasters, etc. Genesis 1:1 begins with the words "in the beginning," which shows the beginning of everything, of age and also of the time. We can also say that it is the beginning of warnings and curses, covenants and promises, and languages too. The book of Genesis opens with a majestic description of how God first created the heavens and the earth, and how he ordered the earth so that it may become a dwelling place. The emphasis is mainly on how God orders or structures everything, including the nature. After declaring God as the creator of all things in the first verse, the focus is then on God bringing things into existence by his word and ordering the created things. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens and the earth here mean everything. The phrase that there was darkness over the face of the deep points to the absence of light then. The Spirit of God was hovering. This comment gives a sense of expectation that something is going to happen on the surface on which God's Spirit is hovering, and every creation that follows after this has the comment "and God said" and ends with the comment "and God saw that it was good." God speaks not just about heaven and earth, water and dry land, day and night, stars in the night sky, but he speaks of the living creatures as birds in the air, and fish in the sea, and every living creature that moves according to its kind. After God says and sees these things that they are good, God blessed them by saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Then on the sixth day, God doesn't say, "Let there be," but He says, "Let us make man in our own image." And the verse that follows says, "So God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him, male and female created He them." Creation of man is not just by word, but the narrator says that God made man from the dust of the ground with His own hands and breathed His breath into his nostrils, and the man became a living being. Here God doesn't just bless man to be fruitful and multiply, but He adds His blessing by saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and over every living creature that moves over on the earth." With this blessing, God also gives man a duty to tend and keep the earth, which means to preserve the earth in its beauty. When it comes to the woman, God created her from the rib that was taken out of man, and God brought this woman to the man. Man accepts this woman gladly by saying, "This at last is the bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." This, in fact, is the origin of first marriage blessed by God. God places this couple in the Garden of Eden. The name Eden conveyed a sense of luxury and pleasure, and the Hebrew term could convey a royal park. This shows that God's best was given to them. A verse in the end of chapter 2 says, "And man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Nakedness in this sentence is nothing more than a picture of innocence of man in a perfect and an uncorrupt world. It connotes to both the physical and the psychological. It is a revelation of self to the other, and there is a sense of belonging. As it is said that every blessing has a command to obey, God with His blessings gives a command to Adam and his wife to obey. There's a tree in the Garden of Eden called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God commanded them not to touch or eat of the fruit of that tree, and also says that the day they eat of its fruit, they shall surely die. In this world of innocence, suddenly a speaking serpent is introduced in the story. Nothing is mentioned of its origin except that it is one of the beasts of the field and God's enemy. Words as crafty and cunning are used to describe it. The narrator captures the subtlety of serpent's approach to the woman. In a friendly manner, he begins his conversation with the woman by asking, "Did God actually say that you shouldn't eat of any fruit in the garden?" As the narrative proceeds, it becomes clear that more than a simple snake is at work here. Clearly, evil entered the created world at some unknown time of God's work of creation. The serpent presents the fruit of the tree as something worth obtaining by saying, "By eating it, you would be like God, knowing good and evil." Here the couple obey the serpent and disobey God. This was not just an act of disobedience, it is an act of treachery. Those who were to govern and tend the earth on God's behalf obeyed one of its creatures. Now the eyes of man and woman are indeed open. They now know good and evil, are no longer innocent as before. When God calls for Adam in the cool breeze of Eden, the couple now hide themselves with a sense of guilt. They are now unable to face God. Eating the fruit transforms the couple, but not for better. This was the fall, after which every kind of sin, suffering, pain, and every kind of physical and spiritual death entered the human race. Spiritual death here is not being able to meet God and talk to Him as they had done before. Now they are ashamed of their nakedness, as innocence is lost. When confronted by God, the blame game begins. Man blames his wife by saying, "The woman you gave me has given me the fruit to eat." And the woman blames the serpent by saying that the serpent tricked her. In his anger, God curses man, woman, and the ground. God pronounces that woman will bring forth her children in pain, and man's punishment involves his relationship with the ground. He will have to struggle to provide himself and his family. God curses man and his wife, saying, "Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return." God himself clothes the couple with animal skin, thus requiring the death of animal to cover their nakedness. But God's gesture towards the couple shows that God still cares and there is hope for them even after the fall. As the story progresses, and as cursed by God, Eve brings forth her children in pain and sorrow, and the story shows mankind plunging further into sin, with Cain, Adam's firstborn, murdering his brother Abel. Adam's lineage continues with his third son, Seth. From generation to generation, mankind still falls and plunges further into sin. In this lineage of Seth, after many generations, comes a man named Noah. The motive of multiplying is first introduced by God in a positive light. However, the narrator says that with this multiplication, after the fall, there was an increase in the wickedness of humanity. God finds man fully corrupt, and the kind of relationship described by the narrator suggests some form of grievous sexual perversion. During this time, God finds only Noah stand apart. The narrator says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on this earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So God thought that he will blot out man from the face of the land. Narrator also says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah's personal righteousness explains why he is warned about the forthcoming deluge. So now God calls Noah, and in his long speech, God gives directions to Noah for the construction of an ark that will be sufficiently large to house his family of 8 and a wide variety of other living creatures. Having made ark according to God's directions, Noah is now told to embark. All other living creatures too walked into the ark in pairs. Once all were in, the narrator says that the Lord shut the door. That is, the safety of those in the ark was in God's hands. Then it rained continuously for 40 days and 40 nights. People inside the ark, that is Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and their wives were unaware of the suffering outside the ark. The narrator then says that when the waters receded, God remembered Noah and everything in the ark. When out of the ark, Noah builds an altar and offers burnt offerings on the altar. God blesses Noah and his sons, saying, I will establish my covenant with you, that never again will I destroy all flesh from the face of the earth. God gives a covenant sign to Noah and puts his bow in the clouds and says that whenever mankind sees this bow, they need to remember the covenant that God made with Noah. After the flood, the descendants of Noah and his sons increase. Genesis also lists the generations of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, born to them after the flood. After many generations, now opens a new episode, the Tower of Babel. This episode begins with the sentence, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Now among these people arose a mighty man called Nimrod, who was a mighty hunter. Under his leadership, people came together and said to one another, come, let us make bricks and let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top to the heavens. The narration goes on where it says that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which these people have built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people and they have one language, and nothing they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So the Lord confuses their languages so that they may not understand one another's speech. With this confusion of language, the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left building the tower. Therefore, the place was called Babel, which means to confuse. This episode of Tower of Babel initially presents a unified humanity using all its resources to build a city. With irony, the narrator points out that it was necessary for the Lord to come down to see the city and the tower. Here, God intervenes by confusing their language so that they cannot understand one another, and thus His plan of dispersing the people throughout the world is fulfilled. Here, God also establishes His blessings of being fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, which He had made to Adam and then to Noah. Thus, the narrator points out that nations were born from Noah's sons after the flood, and these nations spread throughout the world. So, learners, now this is the end of first part of Genesis. As said before, part 1 consists only of the 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Again, from chapter 12 to 50th chapter, we would be discussing that in the second part. The second part, which mainly deals with major characters of the Bible and the book of Genesis and their lineage and their relationship with God and how God intervenes in their lives. Thank you.